Join me once again from London
from London
is our good friend Justin Bronk from RUSI. You guys remember Justin from an episode he did a few weeks ago talking about the no-fly zone efficacy and why it would actually solve Putin's problem, and also where the Russian Air Force has fallen short. Justin, welcome back to the channel. Good to see you.
Thanks. Pleasure to be back.
So yesterday you posted a video on Twitter that was some new footage that the Russians have released. And I thought it'd be good if we did sort of a close reading and some deep intel on what this video footage, this B-roll, if you will, reveals. So let's start by running the video in its entirety, and then we'll do some granular sort of deep dive on the backside of this. So let me first find the video. Here we go. All right. So we'll talk to you in a couple of minutes after we watch the video.
Отработал по земле.
Понял. Второй на боевой.
Понял.
Семерка, выходи.
Понял. 902 отработал.
So there is a lot to unpack there. Let's start with, where do we think these airplanes were operating out of? What base?
So it slightly depends on when this was filmed. And clearly the Russians aren't giving timestamps on this, and the weather is fairly nondescript. The one clue is that in both the sets of HUD footage, so heads-up display footage, the heading tab shows that they're heading between about 190 and 210, so a kind of southwest heading, suggesting that they're flying in from a northerly direction relative to Ukraine. So if this is recorded before the kind of collapse and retreat of the Russian axes down towards Kiev, Chernihiv and Sumy, as well as Kharkiv in the north and northeast of Ukraine, that would fit with operations from probably Baranovichi, which is one of the main Belarusian air bases that large-scale Russian air activity has been using for most of the war. It's also possible that if this is filmed later, or it may just be that if it was filmed in the last couple of weeks even, that this is from bases in kind of the Belgorod Oblast area of Russia, and that they're flying from the north down towards the kind of Donbass area and firing off what appear to be anti-radiation, so KH-31 or Krypton missiles. So yeah, a northerly base most likely, but again, difficult to say for certain.
So let's talk about the types of airplanes we're seeing here and the loadouts, starting with the SU-30.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because up to now, most of the actual strikes that Russia's been conducting with fast jets have indeed been unguided weapons, as we see here. We've got the 6 OFAB 250/-270s. So basically 500-pound class unguided dumb bombs. 6 of them that it's clearly brought back, so it hasn't dropped them. Wherever it got to, clearly it didn't get to the target area. Most of those have previously been being conducted by the Sukhoi 34 fleet, so the fullback, the large flanker fighter bomber derivative, which have been operating primarily out of Lida in Belarus. It's interesting to see a Sukhoi 30, which is a multi-role fighter, but is not particularly strike-orientated with this loadout. Still no evidence at all of kind of guided air-to-ground battlefield type munitions. So no laser-guided, TV-guided, IR-guided bombs or missiles visible on any of these sorties, despite the fact that both the 35 and the 30 are supposedly multi-role fighters and are built as such. Particularly the 30s with the twin cockpit have more kind of capacity as a crew to operate those PGMs. And remember, this is footage selected by the Russian MOD for propaganda broadcast. So one would assume that if they had more sophisticated looking sorties with more interesting and potentially effective loadouts, they would choose to show them. And in this case, all we see is some dumb bombs and otherwise air-to-air and ARM loadouts.
So this is consistent with what we were talking about in the last live stream you were on, that was from the paper you wrote for RUSI about the lack of inventory they have of PGMs, somewhat as a function of their use in Syria and some other training issues and so forth. So again, this supports your thesis that they are not using precision-guided weapons, but they are in fact using dumb bombs. And so this is a 6-by loadout of their OFAB 250s. The other thing to note in this particular photo, or it's actually a screen grab of the video we just saw, is the air-to-air weapon on the wing station is an Archer, an AA-11. And then what do we have on the wingtip there?
So on the wingtips, we've got Kabini pods, so they're self-defense ECM, so electronic countermeasure pods. Interestingly, all the sorties, if I'm not mistaken, in this set of clips, have Kabini pods fitted. Now they attach to the wingtip stations, wingtip rails of most flankers, and almost all Russian flankers are capable of carrying them. In Western parlance, we'd say normally fitted for but not with. So in peacetime ops, you generally don't see them carried all that often. More often, for example, carried by the Sukhoi 34s in the strike role. But interestingly here, all the fighters carrying them despite predominantly air-to-air loadouts, which would suggest that the threat perception is high enough for the Russians that they're not comfortable flying fast jet ops, even at high altitudes or very low altitudes, without the Kabini pods fitted. And this may be a potentially quite significant, if that is the case, it may be quite a significant cap in terms of the meaningful sortie rate that they can generate, because much as Western fighter fleets, particularly in Europe and NATO, tend to have a kind of a diamond standard or a gold standard or a kind of combat standard fleet. So a small portion of your frontline, theoretical frontline force that is actually fitted with all the ECM countermeasures and the top of the line jamming, pods and jammer pods and all of those other bits and bobs. But it's a small portion of the overall fleet. Russia doesn't have enough Kabini pods to equip all of its fighters all the time. So if they've decided that the Ukrainian SAM threat is high enough, and potentially air-to-air threat, which is still there, is high enough that they're only flying with Kabini pods, and they're even with their fighter patrols, then that is potentially a limitation on their strike rate.
So the Archer AA-11 all aspect IR weapon, kind of check me on this, Justin, kind of like their version of the AIM-9 Mike. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah. So the 73M or the AA11, sorry, AA12 is it in NATO parlance? I always
11,
use the Russian
11.
designators.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, 12 is, you're right, 12 is 77. But yeah, so it's roughly an equivalent of an AIM-9M or L. It's worth noting that, generally speaking, the performance of these, from what data we have, seems to be pretty good. And they have relatively old school, but still nonetheless effective helmet mounted sights for almost all flanker pilots, and certainly all the sort of combat standard fits will be generally carrying them. The Russians actually introduced workable helmet mounted sights, or the Soviets, before the West. So it's worth noting that while a lot of Russian kit has been pretty poor in terms of its showing during the course of this conflict, this is a pretty nasty weapon if you can get a flanker within engagement range, roughly similar engagement range to a Sidewinder. And so, with that helmet-mounted sight plus the agility of the flanker itself, getting into a merge is not a particularly healthy thing for any fighter pilot to do with these on board. But of course, interestingly, we don't see these carried by all the fighter sorties here, which is also interesting, given as normal you'd expect at least a pair.
Yeah, and so that's a good segue into the other type model series we see here, which is the SU-35. And in this screen grab, this airplane's carrying 4 by, and I'll use the NATO terminology, AA-12 adders, which we used to call their AMRAAMSky. So to your point, Justin, there's no IR missile on this particular airplane, which is surprising.
It is surprising, in particular because the Russians have a habit of toting around when they're flying and they're not intending to get into serious combat, or not worried about getting into serious combat. They've tended to fly around with their AA-11s and their older R-27s. So in Russian parlance, R-27 plus R-73. Because they don't really care about the carriage life requirements, they'll happily carry missiles for a lot longer than NATO countries would with the carriage life restrictions we put on them. But they've tended to save their R-77s, so that they're AA-12Bs in NATO terms. So these things, because the initial R-77, as the earlier AA-12, had a very, very limited carriage life. It was one of the reasons why the design was never really mass produced. They've slightly improved it with the -1, so the AA-12B, which they're currently carrying, but they've still tended to carry them sparingly. And so to see in this case, a 35 with 4 of them and no 73 suggests that they're not planning on penetrating far into Ukrainian airspace, because otherwise they'd probably carry at least a pair of 73s, as we see lots of sorties doing. So that it probably is fitting with the pattern that we're seeing of most Russian fighter sorties remaining at pretty high altitude, and generally either only crossing Ukrainian borders just a little bit, or actually staying in Belarusian or Russian airspace for most of their flights. In that case, they probably feel they only need those long-range Fox 3s. So yeah, suggesting a relatively simple employment model for that sortie.
Well, here's another screen grab that one of the things to note, besides the SU-35's loadout, is the transport aircraft in the background there. What kind of airplane is that, Justin?
I think it's an AN-72. I think it is. It's a rather odd sort of medium transport aircraft with these overwing stall configured jet engines, which, as you see here in that photo, the Ukrainians actually fly as well. Although the Russians have some. It's a sort of quasi equivalent of something like the C-27 Spartan, although rather older and jet propelled. Yeah, it fits, particularly if this is Baranovichi or another one of the Belarusian airfields, because the Russians are going to have to keep a steady supply of munitions, spares, other logistics components into those frontline bases to support the op tempo they're trying to run. So you'd expect to see quite a lot of air transport movements in and out.
And I imagine that design of the overwing engine is to make their FOD resistance greater, for, unprepared airfields kind of a thing. But that's kind of a sci-fi looking, that's the kind of thing you'd draw in elementary school when you're bored or something. So we mentioned the Krypton seed weapon, SEAD weapon. Here's the SU-35 with one of those. Let's talk about that, and then we'll segue into the HUD footage that we saw there and an explanation of what we're seeing in that footage.
So yeah, the KH-31P, or the in NATO code word Krypton, is a relatively old. I think it was designed in the 80s, but it's an anti-radiation missile derived from an anti-ship missile. It's pretty fast off the rail. It picks up to Mach 3 or a little above, which makes sense. And it's the rough equivalent to the AGM-88 HARM. So it has an in this configuration has an anti-radiation seeker, although it's generally configured for going after NATO SAMs, so things like Patriot, which given that the three different frequency band seeker heads that can be fitted have to be changed at the factory, it can't be changed at the airbase or in flight. It's a relatively inflexible weapon, and it probably wasn't designed really to go up, or at least most of its capabilities weren't designed to go up against Russian-made systems. But clearly they're employing them quite a lot. I'm sorry. There's wreckage of those quite distinctive missile bodies with the four little intakes for the propulsion system have been found in a few places around Ukraine. But of course, as with most anti-radiation missiles, they're good for suppression, because any SAM system that detects one of these being fired, and they have a pretty big signature, will have to either turn off, in other words, deprive the anti-radiation seeker of that radar signal that it needs to home in on, or if it keeps going in order to continue prosecuting an engagement, then that missile will continue to home in and will potentially hit. But basically, if you fire it at standoff, you can push them out to 80 or even 100 kilometers theoretically. But the SAM operator, particularly in mobile SAMs like the SA-8 or SA-11, which the Ukrainians are getting a lot of use out of, the operator will generally have time to turn the radar off if fired from a long distance and move. And while the most modern equivalents, so things like the US Navy's developmental AGM-88E, the ARGM, have a capacity to basically store the detected location with relatively high precision in flight and continue to home in even after the signal turns off. And the HARM was sort of retrofitted with a semi capacity to do that. The PK the probability of kill is still relatively low for those sort of shots, and particularly with an older missile like the KH-31. But it seems to be what a lot of the Russian fighter sorties are actually doing, and have been doing since basically that first week in March, where the Russians tried a serious increase in tempo of low-level ops by day and lost between 9 and 11 fast jets in a few days. And since then, they've been firing a lot of KH-31s in these sort of high-altitude SEAD sorties, but without noticeable success that we've been able to see, at least. Most of the Ukrainian mobile SAM losses that we've seen, and there have been a number, about I think 11 or 12, have generally been from ambushes on the ground or through artillery, and in one or two cases, UAV-guided artillery or missile strikes, rather than this sort of Russian Air Force SEAD activity.
So as you mentioned, the KH-31 is a very fast weapon, Mach 3 plus. Originally designed as an anti-surface ship missile, and they've sort of tailored it to, as you mentioned, it's sort of analogous to our HARM, maybe HARM ER, in terms of the range, 60 to 80 nautical mile kind of capability. We just did the episode about the Growler, and that's a weapon. They don't use HARM anymore. They use the next generation anti-radiation missile. But I think to your point of they're showing us what they want us to see is this is a deterrent, among other things, against the idea that we could place Patriots in theater. This weapon is designed to go against the advanced generation SAMs like a Patriot battery. And so it's interesting that they would show enough leg like this with, that weapon. And also this HUD footage. So let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the heads-up displays. So let's start with the no-lock HUD footage and tell us what we're seeing in the symbology here.
Yeah, so this one's really quite interesting to me because, there's a few things. So on the top right, you see that the altitude, so they're still operating at fairly high altitude. So in this case, just shy of 8,500 meters, about 28,000 feet. So still foregoing that medium altitude block, it's lower than some other reported KH-31 shots. So the effective range will be lower from the missile, but also potentially in range of things like SA-8 if they get too close, in addition to the SA-11s. Traveling subsonic, going in a southerly heading. But interestingly, the scan, so the sort of N3, what looks like an upside down V, on the sort of mid left hand side, means that the radar is scanning. So the radar is scanning for the aircraft in question, and then AN next to it means enemy jamming or ECM is detected. So some sort of jamming capability that it's picking up. But interestingly, although just below the sort of position vector, you see 10B, and that's sort of roughly the scan, the expected target range / scan setting. And on the lower left-hand side, you have XPK, which I don't know what it means, but it's likely either a master mode indicator or a helmet mode indicator. Similar for MPW, there'll be this sort of engagement mode, so something like either an equivalent to something like STT versus TWS, or possibly a master air-to-ground mode or something like that. What is noticeable by its absence, and what you see in the other HUD clip, is that there isn't a launch authorization. So there isn't so this is the second one. So you see just below the velocity vector, right in the middle, you see what looks like NP, and that is launch authorization. So it's the same as LA that you would find in a Western HUD when you have a lock target that is within launch acceptable region for the weapon in question. And here you also, in this second one, have what is absent in the first bit of HUD footage. You have a range tape, and so on the left-hand side, beside the sort of artificial horizon display, you have a range tape, and below that, the range to the locked target, which at this point is 50 kilometers. So well within the effective range of the weapon. So in this one, just before launch, it is clearly locked onto a target. It is within range. It's still a relatively decent standoff range, but it is locked on. Because this stuff is absent in the previous one, it looks to me like they're basically blind firing. So in the no lock, the first of the two firings, they don't seem to actually have a target locked up when they fire this KH-31 off. Now, as any passive homing missile does, or indeed an active seeker head equipped Fox 3, you can fire them off, uncaged as it were. And in the unlikely event that during its flight, a compatible target appears within the limited seeker's kind of field of view, then it may lock onto it and go in. But in overall likelihood, what this suggests is that they're firing off what are ultimately limited stockpiles of relatively expensive anti-radiation missiles with no target locked, at least in this HUD footage. And remember, this is what they're choosing to show us. So yeah, it suggests a wastage of munitions, or at least that a lot of the KH-31s that they're firing have a very limited probability of kill, because they're firing them at quite significant standoff ranges and in some cases with no target locked at all. So purely a suppressive effect, if any.
So here's another screen grab that shows the plume of the KH-31, and here you can actually see that little black dot at the end of the plume is the weapon itself as it travels away. So just note that these are KH-31Ps. The P, I'm guessing, is indicate or indicative of the passive seeker head. And what differentiates that version of the weapon from other KH-31s is it's fired at high altitudes, which allows it to have a greater range. And apparently, unlike our anti-radiation missiles. This one has to be configured at the factory. It has different frequency bands, but you have to figure it out like before you launch what frequency range you're going to be going against, which I think is problematic depending on the threat. Our weapons, don't have to be configured. Now the pods have to be configured, our jamming pods, but the anti-radiation missiles do not, the way that the Krypton needs to be configured. But this is fascinating footage, and as you've said, some of this just seems to be just sort of deterrent in nature, like preemptive suppression with no target really even known, and they're just sort of hosing these things off downrange just for the effect.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth noting. While the Russian failure to deal with the Ukrainian mobile SAMs effectively and reliably has basically caused them to fail to gain air superiority over most of Ukraine, they've got a bit more freedom of action in the east, where they don't have to penetrate far to drop munitions on Ukrainian cities and the Ukrainian forces where they're in dug-in positions that they can hit reliably. And also basically because in order to cover those forward positions, the Ukrainians are having to position their short-range SAMs, their SA-8s, fairly close to the front line. And so there is just a natural wastage in terms of ones that get ambushed or get found and hit with UAVs. And the Russians increasingly using their sort of reconnaissance strike complex constructs relatively effectively for the past 2 weeks, in contrast to the initial few weeks where things were really poorly coordinated. So Ukrainian losses have started to rise there, but it's starting to impose that dilemma on the Ukrainians in the east, where if they want to provide effective air cover with mobile SAMs to their frontline units, they have to get them close enough that they will lose them over time to Russian ground fire, if nothing else. And so, the Russians are getting a bit more freedom of action over time in the east in terms of being able to use their aircraft more flexibly. But again, they've really failed to establish the ability to operate at medium or even high altitude across most of Ukrainian airspace. It's worth remembering that, frankly, aside from the United States, most European air forces, while they have massively better trained crews and they are much more used to operating as part of US-run, coordinated and led high-end complex operations, if the US, let's say, was involved in a major engagement of some sort in the Pacific, and Europe kind of had to try and establish air superiority over contested airspace, largely without US or without the sort of full gamut of US SEAD capabilities, I mean, European air forces would struggle with the same challenge. Finding, fixing, suppressing, and then hard killing mobile SAMs is really hard. It's not that we don't have systems that could do it. The F-35 is a great example of something that could get close enough without huge risk to a lot of these systems when they're operating as pop-up standalone threats, to take them out and has the sensors to detect them quickly and geolocate them very, very precisely, and then potentially employ weapons. But if you're limited to direct attack munitions, things like Paveway or JDAM, then it may take too long to get into launch acceptable kind of parameters of a brief pop-up threat before you lose it. But also, you may, if you're dealing with an integrated threat that's operating as part of a wider network, then with long-range threats as well, then you may not be able to get that close in terms of threat, even with an F-35. So, it's a solvable problem, but basically it requires Europe to have more penetrating assets and a lot more munitions, particularly that sort of mid-range of standoff munitions. Things like the Spear 3, so Selective Precision Effects at Range, which is an MBDA program, which is mainly UK-led, which is basically a powered glide bomb with a standoff range of about 130 kilometers in UNCLASS, and a multi-mode seeker, so that if you get a lock with something like an F-35, you can have 6 or 8 of them internally. You can fire them off very quickly if it's within quite a wide radius, and even if it loses the target On the way in, it's got a multi-mode seeker that will seek out and kill vehicles fairly effectively within a given area. The tools are kind of there. It's just that they're not there in terms of numbers, magazine depth, and crucially, we don't train for it as a major thing. Most NATO air forces and indeed most of the US Air Force don't primarily train for SEAD anymore. You have a few Wild Weasel squadrons that do it fairly as a fairly specialized capability, but even there, a lot of them have spent a large part of the last decade actually doing a lot of close air support because of the deployment tempo that the Air Force has had. So I guess, yes, the Russians have failed to do this, but actually we would find it much harder than I think we're comfortable with, particularly in Europe. And, to me, if there's a lesson that comes out of the air war in Ukraine, from what we can see of it, and it's very incomplete as a picture that we get so far, we'll spend years poring over the details, no doubt. But the big lesson is pretty clear to me. We need to get much more serious about SEAD. It is not optional. And just because we've had that luxury of operating at medium altitude for, above the range of manpads for the last 20 years, in most areas we've been, because the US SEAD, with a bit of help in some cases from NATO allies, has been enough to knock over a limited SAM threat in the first week. I think we need to be a bit humble looking at both the Ukrainian experience of trying to operate against Russian defenses and the Russian experience of operating against Ukrainian defenses. This is a hard problem. We haven't taken it as seriously as we should.
Yeah, point well taken. That was sort of the premise of the Growler episode that I posted on Sunday, and the movement of the EA-18Gs to Spangdahlem, and how that asset is over leveraged. And the poor man's version that I teed up was, in the face of stealth priorities, budget is finite. The Air Force particularly got rid of the Raven with no replacement. We had to use the Prowler a lot longer and in an expeditionary role, meaning not carrier-based role, in ways that nobody ever foresaw. And now the Growler comes on, and you absolutely do need it. And as you mentioned, we have I think what people teasingly say, a mild weasel, not a wild weasel, in the F-16 CJ. And so you put a CJ with a Growler and you have some capability, but it's not as robust as it needs to be for a peer threat, as you're talking about. So how many sorties, do we have any idea how many sorties the Russians are flying over Ukraine on any given day?
So the sortie rate seems to be, it's a bit more difficult to judge the sorties that are going on from Russian bases, because as opposed to Belarusian bases, basically we have reasonably decent data from basically spotters on the departures from the three main Belarusian bases that Russia has been using for most of its air activity in the first month and a bit. But less on, for example, in open source at least, on departures from Belbek and Crimea, as well as the multiple air bases in Russia near the Donbass and up sort of northeast from Belgorod. It seems to be kind of passing together what we see in terms of activity, sightings, and the kind of general thrust of things, plus relatively guarded statements from people like the UK Defence Intelligence briefings and the Pentagon's own briefings, who of course have access to other sources, including over the horizon radar data. Is about between 200 and 300 sorties a day, which is steady. It's not huge. Compared to the number of aircraft they've amassed, it's fairly limited. But it may be close to the limit of what they can do in terms of getting the required countermeasures, the number of things like Kabini pods, which are in relatively short supply. Particularly spares and countermeasures may be suffering because their Air Force just isn't set up to support operations at this scale over a long period, as indeed a lot of European Air Forces would struggle to do. And the US Air Force would probably have more difficulty than it's comfortable with, surging at that kind of percentage of their overall force structure for this time. But what's interesting is that there's still little evidence of serious complexity in terms of their air operations. When you see interviews with Ukrainian pilots, for example, they talk about gaggles of 10 or 12 fighters, for example, but they're not really talking about 10 or 12 fighters supporting a strike package as a close escort, or with SEAD shooters going in alongside the fighters, you get the sense more that there are large-scale fighter sweeps going on, which certainly fits with the footage that we've seen, we've been looking at today, as well as a lot of the departures data that we have for Belarusian bases. There's a lot of fighter sorties, but they mostly seem to be keeping close to their, close to or even on their side of the border, and firing ARMs with limited PK. And all of the strikes are still going in at low level at night with unguided weapons. So pretty limited in terms of effectiveness, except just dropping more bombs on cities, which is a way to create a lot of suffering, but it doesn't really have a huge battlefield effect.
Well, it seems consistent with the way they're fighting the war across all warfare specialties. The other thing we saw in the video was this radar system. What are we looking at there in a very basic sense?
So I must admit, when I first saw this, I spent quite a while trying to track down the designation, and really failed. It's clearly their latest mobile deployable kind of advanced airfield operations / air traffic control radar. So that the large rotating dish, the sort of wire mesh looking thing, is probably either a UHF or slightly higher frequency than that. But basically long range primary surveillance radar. So much as you'd see at airfields, or civilian air bases, it will give you quite a long range look at roughly what's out there and where, but it won't give you kind of target resolution data. You couldn't guide a missile with it. And at least one or more of the other arrays would seem to be either something like an IFF interrogator, so identification friend or foe interrogator, possibly a transponder receiver, so a sort of passive secondary radar collect, so to receive transponder data, which again you'd see at most air bases or airports around the world. And possibly one of these may be able to, if fixed in place with a sort of up-down scan, create a temporary ILS, so instrument landing approach service for aircraft trying to land in crap weather, for example. But annoyingly, it's probably one of the P series. So there's a kind of whole, I think it's P15, P30, P40, P45, P60, P70, P80, P100. These sort of mobile radar systems in that ground-based series that Russia has produced since the mid-Cold War. But I'm not exactly sure what this designation is. I found one other photo of it, which was from a TASS, so one of the Russian state media things, with a photo of it as a sort of generic photo at a Russian airbase of a air control radar, in an article about supply of radars to Iraq for air traffic control at military air bases. But the one that the Iraqis got was a slightly different model. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
So let's finish up with sort of going 30,000 foot on where the war is evolving. Last time we spoke, we talked about how the Russians kind of lurched out of the gate, why they were falling short, and we spoke about the fact that the advance had stalled short of the Dnieper, and they hadn't accomplished any of their goals in terms of the land bridge or the taking of Kyiv. In fact, what it looks like now is they've retreated from Kyiv, and now they're trying to redeploy forces in Donbass, and they're trying to establish that land bridge. We did the episode a couple of days ago about the audacious Hind strike against Russia itself. They attacked I guess we'd call it a refinery in Belgorod, a couple of Mi-24s, kind of a badass mission. And in return, it looks like the Russians have attacked a oil storage facility in Odessa. The other thing that happened in recent weeks was the Alligator LST blew up at Pierside. I know you have some theories on how that went down. It may not have been, because the first reports were it was either a ballistic missile or UAV that the Ukrainians did, but you're a little more suspect of the root cause there. Talk to us about what that might have been.
So yeah, the dockside fire is an interesting one. So it could be, as was reported, a Ukrainian missile strike. I'm slightly skeptical for two reasons. The first one being that, as someone who's been watching the Russian military and analyzing it for 8 years plus, I can attest that Russian ammunition storage facilities blow up with remarkable regularity. Basically, their ammunition handling procedures and storage procedures are terrible. What's more, they keep munitions forever, and so a lot of them are probably less safe to move. It's one of the reasons why we at significant expense, and perhaps probably in the UK we go too far on this, but we decommission munitions after a certain time period and after a certain amount of carriage and movement. The Russians don't really do that. They store things for pretty much forever. But for example, there was some footage the other day, literally 2 or 3 days ago, of the Russians unloading a truckload of anti-tank mines in Donbass, and they open the back of the truck and they're not palleted or crated down, and there's a sort of cascade of anti-tank mines that just sort of fall out the back, and you think, well, it's a mad way to treat munitions. So the odds that while they're hurriedly unloading munitions that have been trapped offshore in a probably poorly climate-controlled ship, being tossed around for weeks waiting to get ashore, that they spilled something or something caught fire and they had terrible storage procedures and they basically had an uncontained cascade effect, and it spread to the ship, and they didn't get the damage control underway fast enough. A is entirely plausible based on past Russian ammo storage and movement procedures, and B, if you look at a lot of the sort of footage of the dockyards as the fire took hold, the first sign that something is sort of untoward is a sort of puff of relatively light colored smoke, which to me would be consistent with something catching fire, that burns at a relatively high temperature. Something like petrol or fuel oil or something, probably not petrol actually, but because it would produce blacker smoke, but something catching fire. And then there's a sort of pause for a minute or so, slightly more, before more flames and smoke start to come up, and that just doesn't really look like a missile strike. For a missile strike, even if you didn't catch the weapon coming in on the sort of footage from far away, you'd expect to see something much more visually distinctive as an explosion. And so, yeah, I think it was an ammunition handling screw up. But still, fantastic news.
Yeah.
But and I've got to be honest, on a personal level, with all we've seen from the past week of the aftermath of Russian troops retreating, which we had plenty of intelligence reports on beforehand, but it doesn't really prepare you for looking at it. It sort of moved slightly beyond the trying not to cheer the destruction of Russian vehicles and Russian aircraft, because obviously there's people inside and that's always awful, but you get to a certain point and at an emotional level just start,
well,
these
so
guys
that
have to lose.
Roger that. And that speaks to the world's response to what you're talking about, which is the footage in and around Bucha as they pulled out civilians lying shot, some with their hands behind their back, tied behind their back. Of course, Russia said this is a false flag, that the Ukrainians staged this with actors, and even some American media types have tweeted that everybody's spaced out evenly. So how can this be something that happened organically, which seems, to put it mildly, profane to make those sorts of accusations. But the calculus is evolving here, if not changing. President Biden spoke on his way somewhere yesterday, again accusing Putin directly of war crimes, and he hasn't taken back what he said before. His staff has tried to parse it out, but so do we stand with our assertion that a no-fly zone remains non-viable, and that we, even you can call it a humanitarian no-fly zone or whatever, but what it results in is blue on red operations inevitably. So is that where we think we are still?
Yep. Unfortunately, I think we are, but I think where it changes the calculus is probably it removes a lot of the excuses for holding back on some of the more extreme sanctions implementations and Russian gas and oil bans, which will legitimately cause serious problems for multiple countries in Europe, and it's not even either. So, it's no surprise that Austria and Germany in particular are really reticent to go with immediate bans. Having said, they'll move towards independence from Russian oil and gas supplies by 2024, but there's a reason why they don't want to do it immediately, which is not necessarily that they don't see the problem as very serious, but it's that they have, through a series of extremely poorly judged political decisions over about a decade, left themselves extremely economically dependent, and so it will really hurt them. And it's easier for some countries to say, well, let's just stop immediately, than it is for others. I think the horror of what's being seen in Bucha and other liberated towns is likely to change that calculus and increase the pressure on countries to do more. And I think it will also unblock some of the resistance to supplies of heavier equipment that might previously have been seen as escalatory. So things like main battle tanks, potentially supplies of MiG-29 or other fighter aircraft. Although, I would just say on the fighter aircraft, while I fully understand the Ukrainian Air Force demanding or asking for F-15, F-16, and saying that they could train their pilots on them pretty quickly, that's entirely true. They could train their pilots to fly them in probably in a matter of weeks, to fly them safely. To fly them effectively would take significantly longer, probably months. But again, I understand people saying, yeah, but this is going to be a prolonged conflict, and or at least it may well be at this point. And so we need to get the process started. The problem was never going to be and is never going to be the training the pilots. The problem is going to be setting up the maintainers, the logistics supply hub, the supply lines, and the infrastructure in country for the Ukrainians to be able to sustainably operate these things. Operating even an F-16 is not easy from a maintenance point of view. It's something, they're a type of, in terms of flight control systems, spares, the way that it's serviced, the way that the electronics work. It's the sort of thing that no Ukrainian Air Force maintainers have any experience with. I'm sure they're very, incredibly motivated, incredibly good, capable people, but it just takes years to set up that kind of infrastructure. If you look at something like the Iraqi Air Force, where the US was basically bankrolling it and had a huge stake in trying to get the Iraqi Air Force up and running properly because they desperately wanted to get out of the country as fast as possible. Pilots were in training for years, but even with the majority of the actual deep maintenance being done in country by US contractors who, for various political reasons, are not likely to be employed in Ukraine while the conflict is ongoing, it still took years to set up that capability. And as soon as the US has pulled out, the serviceability has gone through the floor. I still think the best route to resupplying them is equipment that they already have, not just the training to know how to use as operators, but the supply and logistics and maintenance expertise to know how to support, because that's going to be what makes the difference. I think the atrocities and what we're seeing in terms of the appalling behavior of Russian troops in the occupied territories definitely likely to increase support for heavier weapons supplies, and we absolutely should do that. Ukraine has to win. We know now what goes on in territory occupied by Russia. We already had a pretty good idea from the experience of people in occupied Donbass, but it's far worse at this point in terms of the scale of what's going on. And so, saying, well, maybe they can meet, maybe Ukraine should reach a ceasefire, agree a new line of contact, that kind of thing. I don't think any of us would accept giving up significant swathes of our own countries if we knew, anyway, but especially if we knew that that's what was going on to the people who lived in those occupied territories. But ultimately, still, direct conflict with NATO, A, allows the Russians to escalate to attack nukes, B, probably forces them to in their own mind, and C, is therefore not in the interests of Ukraine either. We need to support them with everything we possibly can to win, financial, through political support, through money. We need to increase the sanctions on Russia, but we need to avoid direct conflict, because nobody wins in that scenario.
Roger that. And lest people think that NATO is caving here, just look at the number of sorties we're flying along the, let's just call it the Article 5 line. They're doing upwards of 150 sorties a day. Harry S. Truman by itself is doing about 80 sorties in support of that NATO contingency operation. So that has to be a deterrent. Again, as we described with the last Growler episode, the movement of those expeditionary Growlers, VAQ 134 to Spangdahlem to directly support NATO is a signal that the Russians should attend to, and I believe they are. Not to mention the electronic order of battle fusion that the Growlers are getting, insofar as it's available outside of NATO circles, is being provided to the Ukrainians. So that's good intel all the way around. So Justin, always fantastic to have you on the channel for your expertise, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. So keep your phones open, and thanks again for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for chatting.
All right, that's going to do it for this live stream. Thanks everybody for showing up and for your questions. This will be available as an episode on the channel as soon as we sign off here. If you're a first-time viewer, please ring the bell and become a subscriber so you don't miss anything. As you can see, we're doing a lot around the war as well as the other stuff that I normally do. Check the links below for merch, including where you can get our t-shirts that we've done a drive in support of the Come Back Alive Foundation that directly supports the Ukrainian military with training and supplies. So we've raised almost $18,000 through the t-shirt drive, and I thank everyone who's participated. So check the episode description for the links on where to get those t-shirts so you can help. All right. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll look to do another live stream when the conditions demand it. All right. See you guys.